foreign aid, development aid, humanitarian assistance is, essential in many places around the world, and for years and years and years was delinked from the question of migration. There's a need to respond to crises or the need for development or whatever it might be. Really basically starting in 2014, the European Union in particular began to look at aid as a means for helping to control migration, and developed, in the case of Africa, an EU emergency trust fund, and about $2.5 billion since 2014 has gone into this fund. And what they've done is essentially taken money that was already sort of in the pot, so to speak, for development aid, humanitarian assistance aid, but instead of using that in the way that had traditionally been used up until that point, they now were making much of that aid conditional on the cooperation of those countries in preventing their own citizens from leaving their countries in many cases, or from serving as transit countries for other people. And in addition to that, some of that aid, which heretofore was being used, again, generally for development aid, generally for assistance, a lot of that aid was now being diverted specifically into security forces to actually prevent movement of people, irregular movement of people. And so, and another aspect of that, when you're looking at some of the governments that were getting this aid, like Sudan and like Eritrea, you're looking at highly repressive governments. In some cases, the heads of state are indicted before the International Criminal Court even, and essentially you're bolstering their security forces, to pen in their citizens that are trying to flee their oppression. And this is being done using development aid, using humanitarian aid, with a humanitarian gloss that's thrown on top of it. And the framework agreements that, in a sense, started with Africa have been expanded. And so when you look at Afghanistan now, and you look at other countries as well, the same conditionality is being placed on aid that basically sets as a condition for that aid that you cooperate on these migration control elements. And other aspects like resettlement. Traditionally resettlement was done based on vulnerability and need. Now you look at the EU-Turkey agreement and some of these other agreements and negotiations in place with Libya and the transfer of asylum seekers, to Niger, is to basically use resettlement as a handmaiden of these migration control initiatives. And so, pity the poor Rohingya refugee who can't stay for one reason or another in Bangladesh and needs to be resettled out of that region. If they're not threatening, to enter the European Union irregularly, the EU no longer has an incentive to resettle that person because their resettlement quotas are already filled as a result of migration agreements with Libya or Turkey or whomever it might be. So what you end up having is what had been, up until recently, humanitarian initiatives, whether it be humanitarian assistance in countries of first arrival for refugees, development assistance, resettlement. All of these things are now part and parcel of this effort to externalize migration controls outside of the European Union to prevent people from setting foot in the EU where they would have due process rights, and to basically make any kind of resettlement totally discretionary, and to limit, in fact, the numbers of people that end up putting their feet on European soil where they would have those due process rights.